I speak 9 languages,
You must be
said
kidding.
Charles,
No, sir,
the
it's
son
serious.
of the black
Let me
cleaning
explain.
lady. Abdul Matin Abdul Haq Nazari let out a soft, condescending chuckle from behind his solid teak desk. 9? He repeated, his voice dripping with amusement. My dear boy, you can barely afford a bus pass. You can't buy fluency. The air in Nazari's 74th floor boardroom was chilled and scentless, purified to a sterile silence. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a dizzying view of the Dubai International District, a kingdom Nazari had helped build. Gold-edged decor and minimalist art spoke of a power so entrenched it had become casual. Beside Charles, his mother, Velma, clutched the handle of her cleaning caddy, her knuckles white. At 43, her face was a map of quiet endurance, her posture forever slightly curved from years of labor. She had brought Charles today out of necessity, a failure in childcare that now felt like a catastrophic error. Nazari, 50 and impeccably dressed in a custom thobe, leaned back. He was a man who traded in billions and reputations, and this moment was a trivial amusement. Let's hear this list, then, he said, waving a hand adorned with a single, heavy seal ring. Indulge us. Charles stood his ground, his worn backpack looking like a stain against the polished marble floor. English, Spanish, French, Mandarin, Russian, Portuguese, German, Japanese, and Fuchsia Arabic, he stated, each language named with crisp precision. A snicker came from one of Nazari's executives by the door. Nazari's smile widened. You see, Velma, he said, not taking his eyes off the boy. This is the problem with your generation. You confuse the internet with an education, you download an app and think you've conquered a culture. Velma lowered her head, a fresh wave of shame washing over her. But Charles didn't flinch. Sir, Charles said, his voice still calm, if a man mocks the seed, he forgets it may grow into a forest. He didn't speak in English. The words that came out were in perfect, poetic, classical, Fuchsia Arabic. The cadence was native, the pronunciation flawless, the proverb ancient and bitingly appropriate. The room went utterly still. The executive's smirk vanished. Nazari's own smile melted away, replaced by a blank stare of disbelief. The language of his ancestors, the tongue of his poetry and his pride, had just been weaponized by a boy he had dismissed as illiterate. Where? Did you hear that? Nazari finally managed, his voice uncharacteristically thin. Charles adjusted the strap of his backpack. The public library, sir. They have an online portal with university linguistics programs. It's free. Nazari could only stare, the foundations of his prejudice cracking audibly in the silent, opulent room. And Charles was only just beginning. The first light of dawn over Dubai was a cold, distant fire, and Velma J. Veilleux was already on the 74th floor to meet it. The air in the offices of Nazari Global Holdings was chilled and scentless, a stark contrast to the warm, humid breath of the city below. Her rubber-soled shoes whispered against marble so highly polished it mirrored the vaulted ceiling, a dizzying pattern of gold leaf and recessed lighting. This was her domain between midnight and 6 a.m., a kingdom of silent, sterile opulence. She moved with an economy of motion born of long practice, her hands, chapped and capable, wiping away the invisible fingerprints of the powerful. At 43, Velma was a sculpture of quiet endurance. Her life was a meticulously balanced equation of 3 jobs, faith, and a ferocious love for her son, Charles. Every swipe of her cloth was a silent prayer for his future, a future she scrubbed into existence on floors she would never own. That morning, however, her sacred routine was fractured. Standing slightly behind her, his shadow long in the early morning light, was Charles. At 15, he possessed a stillness that unnerved adults. His school library, his usual sanctuary, was closed for renovations, and with no family in the country, and childcare an unaffordable luxury, he had nowhere else to go. He clutched the strap of his worn backpack, a stark fabric island in the sea of glass and steel. The silence was shattered at 6:02 a.m. by the swoosh of the main door. Abdul Matin Abdul Haq Nazari entered, a vortex of energy in his immaculate white thobe. He was trailed by a trio of executives who moved in sync with his pace, their heads slightly bowed as they scribbled notes. His voice, refined and commanding, cut through the room as he discussed a merger in Tokyo. His sharp eyes, accustomed to cataloging every asset and liability, swept the room and landed on the anomaly. He stopped. The entourage behind him nearly collided. "Velma," he said, his tone not angry, but laced with a profound condescension. He didn't even look at her, his gaze fixed on Charles. "What is this? This is not a creche. This is the heart of a global enterprise." Velma's spine straightened, a familiar dread tightening her shoulders. "My deepest apologies, Mr. Nazari, sir. There was no other option. It will not happen again." "It had better not. This is a place of business, not—" He finally glanced at her cleaning cart. "Domestic oversight." It was then that Charles took a small step forward. He didn't cower. He met the billionaire's gaze. "My name is Charles, sir. I apologize for the intrusion." Nazari's eyebrows rose slightly, amused by the boy's audacity. A slow, mocking smile spread across his face. He looked Charles up and down, from his discount store sneakers to his earnest face. "Charles, and what do they teach you at your public school? Anything useful? Or just how to loiter in places you don't belong?" The executives offered sycophantic chuckles. Velma closed her eyes, praying for the floor to swallow her son whole, to spare him this humiliation. Charles, however, remained preternaturally calm. "I speak 9 languages, sir." The words hung in the air, simple and declarative. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then, the boardroom erupted in derisive laughter. It was a cruel, unifying sound that bounced off the glass and gold. Nazari laughed the loudest, a rich, booming sound that held no warmth. "9?" he repeated, shaking his head in theatrical disbelief. He took a step closer, leaning in as if sharing a secret with a simpleton. "My dear boy, you can barely pronounce my name." Velma trembled, the weight of their mockery a physical pressure, but she saw her son's face. There was no shame there, no anger, only a deep, unshakable certainty that she had never seen in this room before. Charles looked directly into the eyes of the laughing billionaire, and when he spoke again, the language that flowed from his lips was not English. It was Fusha, classical Arabic, its poetic cadence and flawless pronunciation slicing through the laughter like a scalpel. He who mocks the seed forgets that it may grow into a forest. The laughter died, strangled in a dozen throats. The silence in the wake of Charles's words was heavier and more profound than the laughter it had replaced. The ancient Arabic proverb hung in the air, its poetic resonance a stark contrast to the sterile, modern opulence of the boardroom. Nazari stood frozen, his condescending smile a ghost on his lips. The executives had fallen utterly still, their earlier amusement replaced by wide-eyed shock. The language Charles had used was not the conversational dialect of the streets. It was the refined, classical fuchsia of scholars and poets, delivered with a native speaker's cadence and an unnerving maturity. Velma could only stare at her son. The sounds that had come from him were alien yet beautiful, a secret melody she never knew he could carry. Her shame began to curdle into a dawning, bewildered awe. Nazari was the first to break the spell, a man scrambling to rebuild the walls of his shattered prejudice. He let out a short, forced breath, a poor imitation of his earlier laughter. "A phrase," he declared, his voice tighter than before. "A child can be taught a clever phrase. You memorized it. A parrot can be taught to sing, but it does not understand the song." Charles's expression remained placid. Without a word of argument, he shifted languages as easily as another might take a breath. "L'habit ne fait pas les moines," he said, his French accent Parisian perfect. He then turned his head slightly to the executives, his voice shifting again, the tones becoming crisp and melodic. "Zai Shanghai, Tamen Keneng Hui Shuo, Ren Buke Mao Xiang, Hai Shui Buke Do Liang." In Shanghai, they might say, a man cannot be known by his looks, nor the sea measured with a bucket. Before the stunned silence could deepen, he looked back at Nazari, and a new, more complex set of sounds emerged, rolling and guttural. "В России, говорят, встречают по одежке, провожают по уму," he stated in flawless Russian. "They meet you by your clothes, but see you off by your mind." He had not just translated the same proverb. He had provided its cultural equivalent in 3 distinct languages, demonstrating a deep, intuitive understanding that went far beyond vocabulary. He was not a parrot, he was a conductor, and language was his orchestra. Velma brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes glistening. The emails. For months, she had been deleting what she thought were spam messages from the United Nations online language program, annoyed by the persistent notifications. She had no computer, only a basic phone for calls and texts. She never imagined they were the digital footprints of her son's secret life, a life of the mind he had built while she was building a life of survival. Nazari's intrigue was now a visible, prickling thing, warring violently with his pride. "Certificates," he demanded, his voice a low growl. "Anyone can make sounds. I want to see paper. I want to see proof that isn't just air." Charles nodded, as if he had been expecting this. He slid his worn backpack from his shoulder, the faded fabric a humble banner in the gleaming room. Unzipping the main compartment, he withdrew a simple folder. Inside, protected by clear plastic sleeves, were several official-looking documents. He laid them carefully on the edge of Nazari's teak desk. Nazari snatched the top one. It was a certificate of proficiency from the United Nations Online Language Program for Mandarin Chinese. The grade was 99th percentile. The authentication seal was clear. The registered participant's name was Velma J. Vayu. Velma gasped softly. Those emails. Charles, you used my... I'm a minor, Mom, Charles explained gently, without taking his eyes off Nazari. I couldn't enroll without a guardian's email. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. Nazari flipped through the others. French, Russian, Fuchsia Arabic, Spanish. Each one bore the same official stamps, the same percentile scores, all under his cleaning lady's name. The evidence was irrefutable, yet his worldview rejected it. The cognitive dissonance was a physical pain. This is impossible, he hissed, the documents trembling slightly in his hand. His eyes, dark with a mixture of fury and fascination, locked onto Charles. I do not believe in miracles, especially those that spring from mop buckets. The cruelty of the words made Velma flinch, but Charles absorbed them without a ripple. His gaze was steady, his reply delivered in a tone so soft it was almost a whisper, yet it carried the weight of an anvil. Then perhaps, sir, Charles said, you believe in results. The challenge was laid. It was clean, professional, and utterly devastating. Nazari's jaw tightened. He would not be schooled in his own boardroom by a child. He needed to break this illusion, to prove this was all some elaborate fraud. He snatched the phone from his desk, his movements sharp with barely contained emotion. Let's see how long your magic lasts, he snarled, punching a speed dial number with force. He glared at Charles as the line connected. This is Nazari. Put me through to Laurent in Paris. Now. The line clicked, and the room held its breath, waiting for the connection that would either make or break a boy from the wrong side of the marble floor. The speakerphone on Nazari's desk crackled to life, filling the tense silence with a distant, tinny ring. Each tone was a hammer strike on Velma's nerves. She watched her son, who stood with a posture of quiet readiness, his hands loose at his sides. He looked less like a boy being tested, and more like a specialist awaiting data. Nazari's gaze was a laser, fixed on Charles, his expression a rigid mask of skepticism waiting for the first crack to appear. A voice answered, smooth and professional. Allô, Monsieur Nazari? Laurent, Nazari said, his voice deliberately calm, a stark contrast to the storm in his eyes. I have you on speaker. I need you to describe the primary logistical hurdles for the Bordeaux acquisition. Be specific. Use the technical terms. Now. There was a brief, confused pause on the other end. Très bien, monsieur. Alors, les principaux obstacles résident dans la complexité douanière post-Brexit, notamment la certification des produits d'origine et les barrières non tarifaires. De plus, notre analyse des flux de trésorerie actualisés révèle un risque de change qui n'est pas entièrement couvert par les clauses de sauvegarde. The French was rapid, dense with legal and financial jargon. The executives in the room leaned in, some struggling to follow. Nazari watched Charles, expecting hesitation, a furrowed brow, a sign of the facade crumbling. Instead, Charles began to speak, his voice a calm, simultaneous counterpoint to Laurent's. He says the main obstacles are post-Brexit customs complexity, specifically product origin certification and non-tariff barriers. Furthermore, their discounted cash flow analysis reveals an unhedged currency exchange risk, not fully covered by the safeguard clauses. He wasn't just translating words, he was translating concepts, his tone mirroring the executive's professional concern. He finished a fraction of a second after Laurent, the meaning conveyed with perfect clarity. Nazari's mask slipped, revealing a flicker of pure shock. He quickly reclaimed his composure. "Laurent, what is your proposed mitigation for the currency risk?" he barked into the phone. "Nous envisageons un swap de devises sur 3 ans, avec une banque suisse, mais les contreparties demandent des garanties supplémentaires," Laurent replied. Charles translated without missing a beat. "They are considering a 3-year currency swap with a Swiss bank, but the counterparties are demanding additional collateral." A soft murmur of disbelief rippled through the executives. This was no parlor trick. This was a high-level, real-time interpretation happening in their boardroom, performed by a teenager in a worn sweater. Nazari's mind raced. Scrambling for a more formidable challenge, he stabbed the phone, disconnecting the call to Paris mid-sentence. Without a word, he dialed another number. The line rang twice before a female voice answered, speaking brisk Mandarin. "Nazari Xiansheng, Beijing Fenbu Junbei Hao Lema." "Mr. Nazari, is the Beijing branch ready?" Nazari's eyes never left Charles. "This is Nazari. Report on the Shenzhen manufacturing delays, in detail." The woman on the line launched into a rapid-fire explanation, her words tumbling out in a stream of technical manufacturing terms, regional dialects, and specific names of Chinese components. It was a linguistic obstacle course designed to trip up anyone but a native expert. Charles didn't just navigate it, he glided through it. He listened for a moment, processing, then began to translate for the room. "The delay is not in the primary assembly line, but in the sub-supplier for the polymer composites. The specific component is the Lian Jie key. The connectors. There is a quality control issue requiring a full batch rejection." He then shifted his tone slightly, as if addressing the speaker directly, and asked a clarifying question in perfect Mandarin. "Ni Ning Keren Shi Di Ji Pi Chi Ma." "Can you confirm which batch number?" The woman on the phone, sounding surprised, confirmed the information. Charles relayed it back to the room in English. The seamless back and forth was breathtaking. He was no longer just a translator. He was a mediator, a conduit of complex information, bridging continents in an instant. A profound hush fell. The earlier murmurs of disbelief had vanished, replaced by a stunned, reverent silence. The executives were no longer looking at Charles with curiosity, but with outright awe. One of them, a senior vice president who had laughed the loudest, slowly removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, as if trying to reset his own reality. Velma watched the scene unfold, and the tears she had been holding back for years, tears of shame, of exhaustion, of fear, finally welled in her eyes. But they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a pride so fierce and overwhelming, it felt like a physical force. She saw the respect dawning on the faces of these powerful men, a respect she had never received, now being given freely to her son, her boy, her Charles, who had built a universe of knowledge while she scrubbed floors. Nazari slowly placed the phone back in its cradle. The click was deafening in the quiet room. His arrogance, once an impregnable fortress, was now a ruin. His face was a canvas of confusion, his worldview fractured. The condescension was gone, replaced by a raw, bewildered respect he did not know how to process. He had tried to break the boy with the full force of his global empire, and the boy had not only withstood it, he had mastered it. "How?" Nazari began, his voice uncharacteristically quiet, almost a whisper. But Charles wasn't finished. The real-time test, it seemed, had merely been the preamble. The demonstration of his skill was complete. Now came the application. "The currency swap with the Swiss bank is a suboptimal solution," Charles said, his voice cutting through Nazari's daze. "And the Shenzhen delay is a symptom of a larger systemic issue." He reached once more into his backpack, that seemingly bottomless well of surprises. This time, he withdrew a simple, cream-colored folder. On its front, in neat typed letters, was a title: Project Phoenix. He walked forward and placed it on the desk in front of the speechless billionaire. Nazari, moving as if in a dream, reached out a hand. His fingers, which moments before had trembled with dismissive anger, now hesitated. He opened the folder. His eyes scanned the first page. The blood drained from his face. The confusion and respect in his eyes were suddenly eclipsed by a shock so profound it seemed to stop his heart. He read the title aloud, the words a fragile, disbelieving breath in the silent room. A proposal to save Nazari Global $200 million through AI linguistic integration. The silence in the wake of Nazari's whispered reading of the proposal title was thicker and more charged than any that had come before. The awe that had filled the room now curdled into something sharper, more dangerous. The dawning realization that this was not merely a demonstration of talent, but a strategic assault. Charles was no longer just a prodigy. He was a consultant who had just diagnosed a terminal illness in their empire, and he was holding the cure. Nazari slowly lowered the folder, his knuckles white. The shock on his face hardened into a wary, calculating stare. "$200 million?" he finally said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "You expect me to believe a child has found a $200 million leak in a company that employs 100 analysts?" Charles remained unfazed, his posture that of a scholar presenting a thesis. "It's not one leak, sir. It's 1,000 tiny cracks in your foundation. Your company operates in 47 countries, but your understanding of language is transactional, not cultural. You translate words, but you lose meaning." He took a deliberate step forward, his voice gaining a new, analytical precision. "Take the failed South Korean deal last quarter, the Hengbok Sentinel joint venture." One of the executives, a man with a tablet, stiffened. That was a strategic mismatch. Their demands became unreasonable. "Their demands were consistent," Charles corrected gently. "Your interpreter confused the homophones. You promised them Hengbok, happiness, prosperity, a partnership of mutual success. But the contractual clause, as your team drafted it, used a contextual structure that implied Hengbok, a shipped box, a delivery of goods. You reduced a strategic alliance to a simple shipment. They didn't feel respected. They felt insulted. You didn't lose a deal over money, Mr. Nazari. You lost it over a single syllable." The executive with the tablet looked down, his face flushing. A few others exchanged grim, knowing glances. It was a failure they had rationalized away, and this boy had just dissected it with surgical accuracy. "This Project Phoenix," Nazari said, tapping the folder, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "Explain." "It's a framework," Charles began, his eyes alight with an intellectual passion that finally broke through his calm exterior. "It's not just a dictionary AI, it's a contextual and cultural engine. It would be trained on legal corpora, regional dialects, business etiquette, and historical trade data. Before a contract is finalized in, say, Beijing, the system would flag a phrase like ironclad agreement and suggest that in a Chinese business context, a jade-like promise carries more weight and implies trustworthiness. It would have caught the Korean homophone. It would have noted that the idiom you used in your Madrid presentation translates literally as to take the bull by the horns. But in that region, it carries a connotation of reckless aggression, not proactive initiative. He spoke not like a dreamer, but like a systems architect. He outlined data input streams, neural network training protocols, and integration pathways with their existing CRM software. The executives listened, their initial skepticism eroding into rapt attention. One of them, the head of global operations, found himself nodding unconsciously, seeing the brilliant, simple sense of it. Nazari felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. This was no longer about humoring a clever child. This was a threat to his entire operational structure, a damning indictment of his expensive, Ivy League-educated teams. The source of this threat was incomprehensible. These internal failures, the Korean clause. "That is confidential," Nazari hissed, his voice tight with a mixture of fury and fear. "How did you access our data? Who sent you? Is this industrial espionage?" Charles actually smiled, a small, faint curve of his lips that held no malice, only profound irony. "I used no confidential data, sir. I read the press release your company issued after the Korean deal fell through. You blamed irreconcilable differences in vision. I cross-referenced that with the public LinkedIn profile of your lead Korean translator, which listed his specialties. He is a technical manual specialist, not a business negotiator. The rest," he said with a slight shrug, "was pattern recognition from publicly traded corporate filings and industry news. I simply read what your own translators missed." The audacity of it was staggering. He had built this devastating critique from the rubble of their public failures, pieces they had left lying in the open for anyone to see. He had seen the pattern in the chaos. Velma watched, her heart thundering in her chest. This was a battlefield, just as she had feared. But the weapons were not shouts or threats. They were facts and logic. Her son was winning, and the sheer, terrifying brilliance of it made her want to both cheer and flee. She saw the way Nazari was looking at Charles, no longer as a novelty, but as a rival. Nazari leaned forward, planting his hands on the desk, his body coiled like a spring. The last vestiges of his superiority were gone, replaced by a primal need to regain control. The question was no longer what, but who. "Who exactly are you, boy?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a guttural whisper that filled the room. "This isn't about libraries or apps. This is targeted. How do you know so much about me? About my company's hidden fractures? Who is behind you?" Charles met his gaze, the faint smile still playing on his lips. But his eyes now held a deep, ancestral gravity. The room seemed to contract, the air growing heavy with unspoken history. "Because, sir," Charles said, his voice soft, yet carrying an immense, resonant weight, "our families share a history you've forgotten." Nazari's breath caught in his throat. His expression, which had cycled through mockery, shock, respect, and anger, now settled on something entirely new, a deep, unsettled unease. The boy was no longer just a problem to be solved. He was a ghost from a past Nazari had left behind, and he had come to collect a debt not of money, but of memory. The words hung in the air, a seismic charge that had detonated beneath the very foundations of Nazari's identity. "Our families share a history you've forgotten." For a long, suspended moment, the billionaire said nothing. The calculating executive, the scorned elitist, the bewildered spectator, all these personas fell away, leaving a man stripped bare, grappling with a ghost. The unease on his face deepened into something more profound, a flicker of ancestral dread. "Explain," Nazari commanded, but the word lacked its former force. It was a plea disguised as an order. Charles's demeanor shifted from the poised analyst back to the quiet scholar, a storyteller unspooling a thread from the past. "When I began tracing my ancestry, it was just to understand where I came from. My mother's stories only went so far." He glanced at Velma, whose face was a mask of confusion and dawning realization. "The public records, the digital archives. They're a puzzle. I found my great-grandfather, Samuel Veilleux. His immigration papers listed his former occupation, dock worker, port of Tripoli, Lebanon." Nazari's breath hitched almost imperceptibly. Tripoli. The name was the key to a lock he had long sealed shut. "I kept digging," Charles continued, his voice steady and clear. "I found shipping manifests, crew lists from the late 1940s. It was tedious work, cross-referencing faded names." He reached into his backpack one final time. The executives, who had been statues of silent observation, leaned forward as one. From a protective sleeve, Charles withdrew a single sheet of paper, a high-quality print of a black-and-white photograph. He placed it on the desk, sliding it toward Nazari. The image was grainy, stained by time, but starkly clear. It showed a group of 24 men, their faces gaunt and weathered, standing before the massive, rust-streaked hull of a freighter. They were dressed in rough, simple clothes, their postures speaking of a bone-deep exhaustion. In the back row, a tall, broad-shouldered black man stood with a quiet dignity, his eyes looking straight into the camera. It was a face that shared the same strong jawline and high cheekbones as Charles, and standing just a few feet away from him, one hand resting on a coiled rope, was a young, lean man with intense, familiar eyes, and a proud, almost defiant set to his jaw. It was a face Nazari knew from the oil-stained, cherished portraits that hung in his family's private gallery. His grandfather, Elias Nazari, in the years before the first oil strike, when the family fortune was measured in calloused hands and back-breaking days. "The crew of the Mediterranean Star, 1948, Charles said softly, his finger gently touching the image of his great-grandfather. "Samuel Veilleux. And there," he said, moving his finger to the young man with the familiar eyes, "is Elias Nazari, your grandfather. They loaded the same ships. They lifted the same crates. They shared the same sun and the same struggle. The revelation did not just strike Nazari. It unraveled him. He stared at the photograph and the polished teak of his desk, the gold-edged artwork, the panoramic view of his kingdom. All of it seemed to shimmer and distort, replaced by the ghostly image of a dusty, sweltering dock. He saw not a legendary founder, but a hungry young man. He saw not an anonymous laborer, but the direct ancestor of the boy who now stood before him, a boy whose intellect had just systematically dismantled his own. The myth of his proper bloodline, the unspoken narrative of innate superiority that underpinned his entire worldview, crumbled into dust. They had sprung from the same earth. "You built your empire," Charles said, his voice not accusatory, but filled with a poignant, devastating clarity. "From the sweat and the strength of men like my great-grandfather. You rose, and you left them behind. I'm not here for revenge. I'm just reclaiming the dialogue. I'm reminding you where you came from, so you might finally see where we are." Nazari could not bear it. The weight of the truth, the piercing nature of the boy's grace, the collapse of his own self-mythology. It was too much. He abruptly pushed his chair back, the legs screeching against the marble in a sound of raw dissonance. He stood, turning his back to the room, to the photograph, to the boy, and stared out at the skyline he owned. "Enough!" he barked, the word cracking. He did not turn around. "This meeting is over. All of you, out." The spell was broken. The executives, shaken from their stunned reverie, scrambled to gather their tablets and notes, moving quickly toward the door. Their faces a mixture of awe and fear. They had witnessed something far more dangerous than a business proposal. They had seen their god exposed as a mortal. As they filed out, Nazari spoke again, his voice low and directed at Velma, who still stood frozen by her cleaning cart. He did not turn to look at her. He gazed out at his empire, a man trying to reassemble his shattered pride. "Velma," he said, the name sounding foreign and brittle on his tongue. "Clean the room." The command was a deliberate act of psychic violence. Amidst the seismic revelation, the acknowledgement of a shared, humble history, the confronting of a profound moral debt, he reasserted the only hierarchy he had left. He reminded her, and himself, of her designated place. The class prejudice, deeply ingrained, remained a stubborn stain, even as the truth shone a blinding light upon it. Velma flinched as if struck. The moment of transcendent pride in her son curdled back into the familiar bitter taste of subservience. She looked from the billionaire's rigid back to her son's compassionate face. The chasm between the two men, and the two worlds they represented, never feeling wider or more tragic. The silence in the high-rise apartment that night was different. It wasn't the quiet of exhaustion that usually followed Velma's shifts, but a thick, humming tension. Charles sat at their small kitchen table, textbooks open but unread, his gaze distant. Velma moved through their few rooms, the echo of Nazari's command, "Clean the room," replaying in her mind like a wound that wouldn't close. "He saw the picture," she murmured, more to herself than to Charles. "He saw his own grandfather standing right beside mine, and still—" Her voice trailed off, the hurt too fresh. Charles looked up, his eyes holding a deep, unsettling calm. "Some people need more than a mirror, Mom. They need to hear their own voice. He didn't elaborate, and Velma, too weary to press, let it go. The boy had already moved mountains today. She would not burden him with the pebbles of her humiliation. The next morning, under a sky bleached pale by the desert sun, they returned to the Nazari Tower. Velma realized with a sinking feeling that in the tumult of the previous day, she had left her primary supply caddy, the one with her specialized, non-abrasive cleaners for the marble and gold leaf, locked in the boardroom closet. It was an unaffordable loss. They rode the service elevator in silence, the polished brass and mirrors a mockery of their purpose. When the doors slid open on the 74th floor, they found the executive floor unnervingly still. The weekend quiet, a stark contrast to the previous day's drama. Before Velma could even retrieve her keys, Nazari's personal assistant, a severe woman named Lila, emerged from the shadows. "Mr. Nazari will see you," she said, her tone implying it was not a request. "In his private study." A cold dread trickled down Velma's spine. This was it. He had stewed on his humiliation overnight, and was now going to fire her, to erase the living reminder of his discomfort. She shot a fearful glance at Charles, but he merely nodded, his expression unreadable. Nazari's private study was a smaller, more intimate version of the boardroom, lined with leather-bound books and personal artifacts of his success. He stood by the window, not looking at them as they entered. He looked older, the lines on his face more deeply etched, as if he hadn't slept. "The caddy," Velma began, her voice trembling. "We just came for the caddy, sir, and then we'll be—" "Sit," he interrupted, his voice rough. He finally turned. The arrogance was gone, but in its place was a raw, volatile energy, the anger of a cornered animal. His eyes, bloodshot, fixed on Charles. "This research of yours, this ancestral connection, it's a compelling story, but it changes nothing about the fact that you recorded a private meeting in my boardroom and accessed proprietary corporate information." "I accessed only public data," Charles repeated, his voice even. "Don't play semantic games with me," Nazari snapped, slamming his hand on his desk. The violence of the gesture made Velma jump. "You are a child. You do not walk into my world and make these accusations. You think because you can speak a few languages you understand power? You understand nothing." He began to pace, a caged tiger. "This company was built on discipline, on excellence, on weeding out the weak and rewarding the strong. We hire the best bloodlines, the finest educations, people with a legacy of success. Not. His words failed him as his sweeping gesture took in Velma, her worn shoes, her son's humble backpack. The implication was clear, ugly, and familiar. It was then that Charles moved. He didn't flinch or retreat. He simply reached into the front pocket of his backpack and retrieved a small, black, digital voice recorder, no larger than a thumb drive. "You are right, Mr. Nazari," Charles said, his voice dangerously soft. "I don't understand your kind of power, but I am beginning to understand the cost of it." He placed the recorder on the desk and pressed play. The sound that filled the room was Nazari's voice, but from 2 days prior, crisp and clear. He was speaking to his head of human resources, his tone laced with contempt. "And this new batch of applicants from the local university is, as expected, underwhelming. I don't care about their grades. I care about their pedigree. We need people with a history of excellence, Hamid. Pure bloodlines. Not these unqualified locals who see a job here as a lottery win. They lack the instinct, the innate quality. They dilute the brand. Hire the 2 candidates from Oxford and the one from the Swiss boarding school. At least their families understand the weight of a legacy. The recording stopped. The silence it left behind was absolute and suffocating. Velma brought a hand to her mouth, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. The ugliness of the words, the casual, institutional bigotry, was far more devastating than any personal insult he had ever thrown her way. This was the rot at the core of his empire. Nazari had frozen mid-pace. All the color drained from his face, leaving a waxy, gray pallor. He stared at the tiny device as if it were a venomous serpent. He had been exposed, not by an enemy, not by a rival, but by his own unthinking, unguarded voice. The hypocrisy was laid bare. The man who had built his fortune from the sweat of a dock worker now openly mocked unqualified locals. The descendant of laborers worshipped at the altar of pure bloodlines. Charles picked up the recorder. He did not hold it like a weapon, but like an artifact of profound sadness. "Sir," he said, and the word was stripped of all deference, leaving only a stark, moral question. "If brilliance has a bloodline, where do you think yours began?" The question hung in the air, echoing in the plush silence of the study. It was the final, devastating blow. It connected the dockyard photograph to the recording, weaving together the past and present into an inescapable net of truth. Nazari saw himself, truly saw himself, not as the masterful CEO, but as a man who had built a palace on a foundation of sand and forgotten the sand itself. He saw the ghost of his grandfather in Charles's eyes, and he heard the echo of his own ugly prejudice. He was a hypocrite, and he knew it. Charles didn't threaten. He didn't say he would release the recording. He didn't need to. The power had irrevocably shifted. He simply offered a choice, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a judge's gavel. "You can change," Charles said, "or you can continue to be the man on that recording. The choice is yours, but you don't get to be both." Nazari did not speak. He could not. His eyes remained locked on the small, black recorder in Charles's hand. The silence stretched, thin and sharp as a razor's edge. For the first time in his adult life, Abdul Matin Abdul Haq Nazari was not in control. The boy from the wrong side of the marble floor held the future of his legacy in the palm of his hand, and all he had done was force the billionaire to listen to the sound of his own soul. The silence in the private study was a living entity, fed by the ghost of Nazari's own voice echoing from the recorder. He remained standing, his back to the panoramic window, but his posture was no longer that of a king surveying his domain. It was the defensive hunch of a man whose inner fortress had been breached, its hollow core exposed. He could feel the weight of the dockyard photograph, and the recording pressing down on him. A 1-2 punch of historical and personal truth, from which there was no recovery, only reckoning. Charles did not gloat. He did not press his advantage. He simply stood, the recorder now pocketed, his gaze steady. He had not come for vengeance. He had come for accountability. "What do you want?" Nazari's voice was a ragged whisper, scraped raw from the depths of his shame. It was the question of a man who understood that power had changed hands, and the new regime was now dictating terms. Money? A position? Name your price. Charles shook his head, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. The price was already paid, sir. By my great-grandfather on those docks. By my mother on these floors. I'm not here to collect a debt. I'm here to propose an investment. He reached, one final time, into his backpack. This was not the folder of Project Phoenix, a blueprint for corporate efficiency. This was a simpler document, a few pages held together by a single clip. He laid it on the desk between them. "This is a draft memorandum of understanding," Charles said, his voice clear and purposeful. "It outlines the creation of the Value Scholarship for Linguistic Excellence, a fully funded program to identify and nurture gifted students from underprivileged backgrounds worldwide. It will provide them with the resources I never had: master tutors, immersive software, access to global language labs. Its first-year endowment will be $10 million, funded directly by Nazari Global." Nazari's eyes flickered down to the paper. The number was significant, but it was the name that struck him. Value. It was not a demand for personal wealth. It was a legacy, a monument built from the ruins of his own prejudice. "Secondly," Charles continued, his tone softening as he glanced at his mother, who stood trembling by the door, "you will create a new position, Facilities Operations Supervisor. You will promote my mother, Velma J. Value, to this role, with a salary commensurate with her new responsibilities and the dignity she has always deserved. Her years of knowing every inch of this building, of managing supplies and schedules in silence, make her more qualified than any outsider. She will no longer report to a junior manager, but directly to the head of corporate operations." Velma's breath caught in her throat. She looked from her son to the billionaire, her mind unable to process the words. Promotion, salary, dignity. They were concepts from a parallel universe. Words she heard in the elevator, but that never applied to her world. Nazari did not look at the document. He looked at Charles. He saw no triumph in the boy's eyes, only a profound, unwavering expectation, not for a transaction, but for a transformation. The boy was offering him a ladder out of the moral abyss he had fallen into. He was being given a chance to be more than the man on the recording. Without a word, Nazari walked to his desk, picked up a heavy lacquered pen, and flipped to the final page of the memorandum. His hand, which usually signed contracts worth hundreds of millions, trembled slightly. But it was not a tremor of fear. It was the physical manifestation of an awakening, the cracking of a long frozen shell. He signed his name with a flourish that was both an ending and a beginning. He then turned to his intercom. "Layla," he said, his voice stronger now, cleansed by the fire of his humiliation. "Assemble the senior executive board in the main conference room, immediately." 15 minutes later, a confused and curious board found themselves seated around the same table where they had witnessed the linguistic spectacle the day before. Nazari stood at the head, Charles and a bewildered Velma standing slightly to the side. He held up the signed memorandum. "Effective today," Nazari announced, his voice carrying a new, unfamiliar resonance. "Nazari Global will endow the Value Scholarship for Linguistic Excellence Furthermore, I am promoting Velma Veilleux to the newly created position of Facilities Operations Supervisor." He paused, letting the shockwave ripple through the room. Then he turned fully to Velma. The entire board's gaze followed his. He looked at the woman he had ignored for years, the woman whose silent labor had underpinned his comfort, the memory of his own command. "Clean the room," burned in his mind. "Velma," he said, and for the first time, his voice held something akin to reverence. "You cleaned my office for years." He took a slow breath, the words costing him a piece of his old self. "Today, you cleaned my conscience." It was an apology, an acknowledgement, and a tribute, all in one. The dam holding back Velma's emotions broke. Silent tears streamed down her face, not of shame or fear, but of a validation so deep and so long awaited that it felt like a rebirth. She did not wipe them away. She let them fall, each one a testament to her endurance, her faith, and her son's impossible courage. Charles then stepped forward. He looked at Nazari, not as an opponent, but as a man who had just chosen a better path. He extended his hand. For a heartbeat, the room froze. It was the ultimate symbol, the son of the cleaning lady extending the hand of reconciliation to the billionaire. It was wisdom offering a partnership to wealth. It was humility inviting privilege to ascend. Nazari looked at the offered hand. He saw the calluses from a life of work, the slender fingers that held so much power. Then he reached out and took it. His grip was firm, a seal on their new understanding. The room remained silent, but the air had changed. A battle was over, not a battle of intellect or will, but a battle for a soul. And in the quiet, tear-streaked dignity of a mother, and the steady handshake of her son, a victory had been won for them all. 6 months later, the air in Atlanta was thick with the promise of a southern spring, and the atmosphere inside the newly inaugurated Veilleux Linguistic Center hummed with a different kind of energy, the vibrant electric buzz of potential. Gone were the cold marbles and gold leaf opulence of Dubai. This building, a beautifully renovated historic library, was all warm wood, natural light, and the palpable sense of a door being thrown open. The atrium was a symphony of global voices. A group of teenagers from a favela in Rio de Janeiro practiced Portuguese conjugations with a digital language coach. A young woman from a rural village in Kenya, her face alight with concentration, worked through an advanced Mandarin module. A boy from Beirut and a girl from Lagos debated the nuances of poetic metaphor, their laughter bridging continents. These were the first scholars, their lives already being rerouted by the endowment Nazari had signed into existence. At the center of it all, guiding a reporter and a small film crew, was Velma Veilleux. But she was not the same woman who had trembled in a billionaire's boardroom. Dressed in a simple but elegant professional suit, her posture was straight, her smile easy and genuine. She was the center's operations director, a title that came with a generous salary and, more importantly, profound respect. She pointed out the state-of-the-art recording studios, the collaborative tech hubs, her voice filled with a pride that had been forged in the fires of hardship and polished by this hard-won victory. The radiance she emitted was not from a spotlight, but from within, the quiet confidence of a person who had finally been seen. In one of the glass-walled research labs, the cameras found Charles. At 16, he had grown an inch, but it was the growth in his presence that was more remarkable. He stood before a large smartboard covered in complex algorithms for his latest project, cross-cultural AI linguistics, the practical, evolved offspring of Project Phoenix. He explained to the reporter how the AI was being trained to understand not just words, but cultural context, emotional intent, and historical subtext, to prevent the very errors that had once cost Nazari millions. The reporter, a seasoned woman with a keen eye for a story, finally asked the question that hung in the air. "Charles, this is an extraordinary journey, from a difficult situation in Dubai to leading a research team here. What drives you? What is the core of all this?" Charles didn't look at the cameras or the algorithms on the board. His gaze found his mother through the glass, her figure a calm, dignified anchor in the bustling center. A soft, knowing smile touched his lips. "My mother," he began, his voice clear and carrying, "spent years cleaning floors, but while she worked, she taught me words I'll never forget." He paused, letting the memory settle. She said, "Son, dignity is a language the world must learn to translate." The words settled over the room, simple, profound, and devastating in their truth. It was the moral of the entire story, the seed from which everything had grown. It wasn't about intelligence or wealth. It was about the fundamental grammar of human respect. As the reporter absorbed this, a figure stepped forward from the periphery of the group. It was Abdul Mateen Nazari. He was dressed not in the imposing, formal attire of a Gulf billionaire, but in a smart, understated business suit. The arrogance that once defined him had been sanded away, replaced by a thoughtful, grounded demeanor. He came to stand beside Charles, not in front of him, a visual representation of their new dynamic. The reporter turned to him, intrigued. "Mr. Nazari, this center and the scholarship fund represent a significant shift in your philanthropic focus. What prompted this change?" Nazari looked at Charles, then at Velma, his expression one of genuine, hard-earned humility. He did not speak of lost contracts or public relations. He spoke of a personal revolution. He nodded slowly, a faint, self-aware smile on his face as his eyes met the reporter's. "What Charles said is the lesson," he acknowledged, his voice quiet but firm. "And he confessed, his gaze sweeping over the diverse, brilliant young faces in the room, a living testament to the change he had chosen to fund, "am still learning to speak it." In that moment, standing in the center named for her family, with her son the visionary and the reformed billionaire as his supporter, Velma knew the translation was complete. The language of dignity, once a whisper in the silence, was now being spoken, heard, and understood. The journey to the port of Tripoli was a pilgrimage into silence. The modern cranes and container ships of the active harbor were a world away from the ghost they had come to find. Nazari had arranged for them to visit a preserved historical section of the dockyards, now a museum. The air here was different from Dubai or Atlanta. It was heavy with the salt of the Mediterranean and the weight of forgotten stories. They stood on the very spot, the weathered wooden planks rough beneath their feet, where the black and white photograph had been taken a lifetime ago. Nazari, Charles, and Velma. The billionaire, the prodigy, and the mother. The past and the present, had finally converged. Nazari was quiet, his gaze fixed on the rusting hull of an old freighter permanently moored as a monument. He could almost hear the echoes, the shouts of the foreman, the grunts of men straining under heavy loads, the laughter of his grandfather and Charles's great-grandfather, sharing a moment of respite. The phantom sounds of a shared beginning. I looked at this place as a story of how far we had come, Nazari said, his voice barely a whisper. I never saw it as a reminder of what we had left behind. A week later, at the Global Business and Ethics Forum in Geneva, Nazari stood at a podium before the world's financial elite. The man who had once prized his infallible image now deliberately dismantled it. I built an empire, he confessed, his voice resonating through the silent hall. I measured its worth in billions and its people by their pedigrees. I was wrong. He paused, the admission costing him his old identity but granting him a new one. I have learned that wealth without humility is merely poverty of the soul. True success is not a monument you build to yourself, but a bridge you build for others. Back in Atlanta, at the Value Center's inaugural graduation for its first class of scholars, Charles stood before the young minds from every corner of the globe. They were the seeds he had spoken of, now sprouting into a forest. He looked at them, these kids who knew the struggle of being underestimated, and his voice was clear and strong. They will try to define you, he told them, by your address, by your parents' jobs, by the language you speak at home. They will tell you to know your place. He leaned forward, his eyes burning with conviction. But remember this, you are not defined by the floors you clean, but by the heights you dare to climb. Your mind is your territory. Claim it. The room erupted in applause. The camera, if one were filming, would have panned across the faces. The Kenyan girl, the Brazilian boy, Velma with her hand over her heart, beaming with a mother's boundless pride. And it would have found, finally, Abdul Mateen Nazari, the man who had once laughed at the cleaning lady's son. He was not on the stage. He was standing among the audience, his hands clasped respectfully. As Charles finished his speech, Nazari began to applaud. Not the polite, measured clap of a benefactor, but a firm, resonant, and heartfelt applause. He was applauding the boy, the truth, and the downfall of his own arrogance. He was honoring the heights that had been climbed. For in the end, the story proved that true brilliance doesn't need wealth. It needs opportunity, courage, and the humility to listen.